Hey out there, rock and rollers. Welcome to the 60th episode of the Ugly American Werewolf in London Rock Podcast, recorded here in northwest central London, just off historic Abbey Road. We want to thank everybody for listening to Exile on Main Street review, coming up on 50 years for Exile. That was our show last week, and we got some nice comments on that. We appreciate it. We think it's the high watermark for the Stones, and we are huge Rolling Stones fans, so it means a lot to us. But it kind of brings up the age-old debate. Back in the day, it was always the question, are you a Beatles fan or a Stones fan? They kind of pitted each other against each other in the press, even though basically they were colleagues and friends. But you could hear Keith Richards talk about how sometimes they would know, oh, the Beatles have their new single coming out next week. All right, well, we'll wait a couple weeks after that before we put out our new single. Talk about it as kind of a double act throughout the 60s. They were the two big ones who really survived. There are other bands, obviously, who did well and were influential and maybe even are still around to this day, maybe one or two, but none of them had the influence that the Beatles and the Stones did. Now, Jackson and I were not enormous Beatles fans growing up. We liked the Beatles, sure, and I had a couple of Beatles records, but it just wasn't who I wanted to listen to all the time. In some ways, they were a little elementary in that I used to love Dr. Seuss, but I don't read him anymore, right? They were just such a bedrock foundation, learning your ABCs. You have to like and understand some of the Beatles music if you're going to like rock and roll. But our tastes evolved past the Beatles, and we're big Stones fans. But when the Get Back documentary came out, I was intrigued by it, as were millions and millions of other people around the world. And if you've seen this, God, it's an amazing piece of film. Basically, the premise is the Beatles had already made the White Album a couple months before. It was all over the charts. Now their idea was they had not played live since '66, but they did Hey Jude on a TV show with a bunch of kids in a studio, and they kind of had fun playing it live and having a bit of an audience around them. So the idea was, in the first 2.5 weeks of 1969, let's write 14 songs. Why 14? I guess most of their albums had 14 songs. Let's write these 14 songs, and we'll record that for an album, and we'll play it live as a TV special, and we'll get a documentary out of making all this. Pretty ambitious project. So they went to Twickenham Studios, but they hadn't been playing together for a while. They'd always been tracking for the last couple of years, so the idea of playing it all live together at once was ambitious, especially given the way they'd been recording for the last couple of years and had not been playing live at all. And so Michael Lindsay Hogg made the film, shot over 150 hours of film for this, was always pushing to do more to make sure we got that location to do the live show, because that was the payoff for him in his film. It didn't really work out that way as far as an exotic location, but we did get the iconic Beatles last concert on the top of Apple Studios on Savile Row. That's the payoff at the end. It was an amazing. Lots of great cast of characters. Of course, George Martin is around. Glenn Johns is around. You see a little bit of Alan Parsons running tape in there. Of course, the ladies in their lives were all there, with, of course, Yoko just not being farther than 3 inches away from John. We'll talk more about her later. Before we get into the show, I just want to remind you that you can reach out to us on Twitter at @ugly_werewolf and at ActionJack72. And you can see all past episodes at www.uglyamericανwerewolf.libsyn.com. We are joined this week by our friend Neil from DefLepPod. Neil's a great guy, and he's also a native Liverpudlian. Now, he, like us, was never an enormous Beatles fan. He is obviously a big Def Leppard fan, as his DefLepPod is a fantastic podcast, and I suggest you go check that out. But being someone who grew up in Liverpool, surrounded by ongoing Beatlemania his whole life, probably having old men in pubs telling him how great the Beatles were since he was a wee lad, we thought he'd be a great guest to have on to kind of share what we learned in this documentary, how we felt about the Beatles and interacted with their music growing up, and just have a great conversation. And with Neil, it always is. We had a lot of fun doing this, and I think that shows in the show. We really hope you like it. So without further ado, you got The Wolf, Action Jackson, and Neil from DefLepPod reviewing the Beatles Get Back here on The Wolf. Welcome back to the show. You know, we had a blast having you on the last time, and we recently did our our kind of end of year, our best of 2021 show. I appreciate that, and it was easy when we ranked the shows. It was obvious to both of us that we had the most fun talking with you. I mean, someone who we never talked with, it's like, man, this guy loves, the rock music the same way we do, and Jackson, look, I'm the one who's like leading everybody, trying to get everybody excited. Jackson's kind of like the more chill, yeah, man, whatever. But anytime we have a guest on, we'll have a recap afterwards, and sometimes it'll be recorded for the show, and sometimes like, oh yeah, he was cool, or oh yeah, we should have talked about this. He come back, oh man, that was fun. That was so awesome, dude. Like that was a blast.
I could only reciprocate the sentiments. It was exactly the same for me. So cool, and that's why I'm more than happy to come on to talk about a band that I never really liked. But I love though the documentary. So
well, right, yeah, and that's the thing. I mean, I wouldn't say we don't like the Beatles, me and Jackson. It's the Beatles,
yeah,
right? I mean, the Beatles are kind of like your ABCs, and it's like I still like Dr. Seuss. I just don't read him anymore. Love Me Do is almost like a nursery rhyme now. It's not exactly groundbreaking or cutting edge, but it's like we wouldn't have all this other stuff that we love without the Beatles, obviously. But yeah, Jackson and I are more Stones fans. We went that route. That's just who we are. But not only because we love talking to you, we figure, well, as someone who is from Liverpool, where they must just shove the Beatles down your throat from birth, I wanted to get your take on it. You know what I mean? Getting the English perspective, I think, is what made our show so much fun the last time. So, hey, none of us are huge fans, but we all love the documentary. We all owe the Beatles a big debt of gratitude. So I wanted to hear, how growing up, what was it like as far as, did you have friends who were way into them? We were like, Jesus, what's wrong with those people? Was it your parents who were into them? Like, what was the story?
Well, what's interesting, I'll talk about it more later, is Get Back documentary has fairly significantly changed my view on the Beatles.
Interesting.
And so it's actually had quite, I wouldn't say profound effect, that sounds too much, but it's had actually quite a big effect in terms of what I've been listening to over the last few weeks, put it that way.
Cool. Good to know. Yeah, I like that. What about you, Jackson? Jackson's actually in Texas right now instead of on the East Coast. So we're spread out a little further than we usually are this week.
So yeehaw. Yeah, I mean, I never really listened to the Beatles growing up. My parents did. I think we may have had Revolver somewhere in the house. Never really listened to it. Like you were talking about before, I was always a Stones guy, and the Beatles it was almost too easy. Oh, I like the Beatles. Everybody likes the Beatles. Duh. Right. But and then I remember, when did that number ones come out with the red cover?
It's after we were in college. I mean, it's after
yeah. So it was probably like mid 2000s maybe. And I was going on a road trip, and they had a standalone display of it. It was at Target or something. And I said, you know what? Pick that up. I mean, every song on there. And the voice in the back of my head said, you're better than that. Don't do that. Don't do that. If you want to listen to the Beatles, listen to the whole thing. Don't do the hits. And I just started working it backwards from there. And I'm like, yeah, these guys were so far ahead of everyone else as far as like musicianship. Maybe not musicianship, but as far as like writing songs and just the prolific output. Mm-hmm. And the fact that they went from this boy band to this, radical, psychedelic, over the top group of guys. It just gave me a much better appreciation for them. And I actually talked to a guy his daughter was maybe 20-ish, and she had a boyfriend, and he was like, yeah, I was trying to talk to him about the Beatles, and he doesn't listen to them. I said, check back in 10 years. Check back in 10 years, and I guarantee you he'll have a much better appreciation. So that was my kind of journey into it, just getting involved with them. But yeah, once you get into it, wow, it's amazing.
Yeah, and I guess I kind of found them to a degree in high school. Once I started buying CDs, the expense of CDs made it, I can't just take a chance on CDs. Maybe I could take a chance on a cassette. But CDs, which were $15 American back then, that's like $40 today. As a teenager, I don't have that money. So if I'm going to get something, I got to know it's going to be something I'm going to want for years, right? So, right. I mean, I think I got the White Album as one of my first 10 or 20, one of the 24 million people in America to buy the White Album over the years. And of course, that has diverse Beatles stuff on it. That doesn't just have Love Me Do and I Want to Hold Your Hand. It's got not only the compositions that Paul and John wrote later, but suddenly George has a little more something to say, and they let Eric Clapton do a little ghost guitar work on there, and Ringo gets a song, so it's like broadening their horizons. And of course I had Sgt. Pepper's because it was kind of like, well, you gotta have that one. I'll tell you what really got me into them was Cinemax is part of HBO, Neil. Cinemax is kind of a cable TV network that, like, if it's a little too raunchy or it's not family friendly enough for HBO, they stick it on Cinemax. And they had Help, the movie Help, on Cinemax one night, and I recorded it. Yeah, I recorded it on VHS cassette along with the Jimi Hendrix movie afterwards. And I watched that thing over and over again and saw them as, yes, they made this great music, but they're also kind of comedians. They didn't take themselves that seriously, right? They would take the piss out of themselves as quickly as they would anyone else. So they're like, okay, well, they're fun and all. It's just Help, yeah, great songs on there, but at that point I was into Rush and Van Halen and Led Zeppelin, and the Beatles were just not hard enough for me.
Yeah, it's interesting what Action said as well, and I think it's spot on in terms of if you take from, say, 1962, which is their first single, to 1969, which is the year that Get Back is from, and the Abbey Road album and Let It Be album. I mean, it's quite difficult when you think about those 7 years. Which Beatles are you talking about? Because I'm going to have a very different conversation with you about what I think about post-Revolver and afterwards Beatles to the Beatles before Revolver, and especially that early stuff in 62, 63, like I Want to Hold Your Hand and things like that. I've got no real interest in that.
Right.
But maybe from Rubber Soul, possibly. Then I'm starting to think, okay, this is I'm a little bit more interested in. I think sonically it changes then as well. Because I don't know what you think, but I don't know if it's chord and techniques. So there's something about that early 60s sound that I find it quite difficult to connect to. It just sounds really old.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like in the same way I don't listen to like Glenn Miller. It just sounds old.
Right.
But then something happens around mid-60s, I don't know where it is, where the music starts sounding more contemporary, what we could consider modern rock music. And that might be terribly sort of shallow on my part in terms of letting that bother me, but it just becomes much more accessible and easier on the ear to me sonically once you get sort of around like 1966.
I think I'm with you there. And even the Stones, their early stuff, if I hear Satisfaction on the radio, I might change the channel. Whereas, 30, 40 years ago, I'm like, oh, it's the Stones, turn it up, So, yeah, no, you're right. Some of that early 60s, something happened, whether it was they finally got with Bob Dylan and started to think about how they could change it, or the Beach Boys eventually did Pet Sounds, like, wow, they're just a bunch of surfer dudes, and then they made this amazing thing. We need to up our game. Plus, I do think that once they decided to go off the road in 66, after they had the deal in Manila with Imelda Marcos, and they had the deal in the South of the USA with the KKK burning their records, and the whole the Beatles are bigger than Jesus Christ thing doesn't go over with the Christian population in America. They're like, why do we even want to tour? They don't listen to us. They scream the whole time. They can't hear us. We can't hear us. Traveling is a nightmare because they chase the plane and the car and everything else. Let's just stay home and sell records that way. And then they didn't have to worry about how do we play this live. They could just expand and do all sorts of different soundscapes and use different instruments to create something that they don't have to worry about. We don't have to play it live. We're just going to put it on a record and stick it out there.
Well, and then you kind of get into the whole them working with George Martin and how because I remember Lennon was saying something about how I want to have a radio playing in the back. I want to have a live radio feed or something. And Martin's like, all right, cool, give me 20 minutes and I'll figure out how to make that work. They had these ideas, but then once they really started to get into the studio wizardry, they could make it. All the things in their mind actually come together, and once they got into multi-tracking, and they really embraced let's see what we can really do. Once they abandoned the idea of ever playing that stuff live again, now it can be whatever. We can track it a zillion times, backwards, forwards, add layers to it, whatever you want to do. And I think that's when they really took off to the stuff that we like.
What's really interesting about Get Back as well, that whole idea of we don't want to tour anymore and we'll spend more time in the studio. I've always known about that because I've heard the stories about Ringo Starr putting his cymbals almost vertically because he thought someone might try and assassinate him, and it was too noisy and all of this stuff. And they were actually sort of scared of touring almost at the end. And it's really interesting. I think you see the hangover for that in Get Back, which is what beginning of 1969, where like George Harrison just doesn't want to do anything or go anywhere ever. And you can really see how that experience, like in 63, 64, 65, 66, all that touring, it's still there with them in 69, where most of them, with the exception of Paul McCartney, which we'll probably come to, just seem completely jaded and just like never ever want to leave England ever. Never mind leave England again. They don't want to leave their big country house just outside of London or wherever it is to live in. You can really just see them just like thinking, I just don't need to see the world again or the States or wherever. And that's all still there in 1969. It's like really interesting to actually see that on the screen for the first time. Something that you've only really read about and actually see evidence of it almost.
Well, that was one of the things that really struck me too when they were talking about what they were going to do for the final product on Get Back. Okay, so we're going to make these songs and then we're going to do what? TV show, blah, blah, blah. And Michael keeps pushing the idea of, okay, so what are we going to do? What are we going to do? And Paul says, Ringo doesn't want to go anywhere, so I don't think we're going to go anywhere. Okay, dude, if you wanted to go somewhere, you'd have gone. So you were kind of using Ringo, as the scapegoat too. But you're right. They were like, we've already been everywhere. We're not going anywhere. We like it here where it's safe and comfortable. And no, not doing it.
Yeah, and Lindsay Hogg wanted to go to Libya, and I'm like, in today's world, going to Libya is the dumbest idea I can think of. It's like, let's go to the middle of Sudan, like on the border of the war zone. What do you think? Now, the shots of the place, it looked amazing. I mean, it looked like someplace Pink Floyd would have, played back in the 70s. It was really cool. But again, it's like, do they sell a lot of records in Libya? Does that really make a lot of sense? I don't know. Not to mention, I don't know if Michael Lindsay Hogg is related to Dennis Eaton Hogg, who owned the record company Spinal Tap was on those many years, but it seems like they might have a relatively common, by the way.
Could have been.
Not as big a thing over here, Spinal Tap. I think Bad News is a bigger deal over here than Spinal Tap as far as like bands on the road getting in trouble there, Neil. But you can educate us on that, maybe.
But to me, that was one of the big takeaways, or one of the things that really stood out to me, especially at the beginning, was they were getting back together. They were kind of just starting to feel each other out again. You had them trying to feel their way out, and Michael just hammering this concert. Okay, what are we going to do? Okay, take it easy, buddy. Okay, so let's talk about that. What are we going to do? What are the plans? And it was like that. He had a mission to get this thing done, and they were like, we're not even sure we want to do this, really. And so it was those two things of, he was the business, I need to make this happen, and they were more the organic, let's just float along here and see what we come up with.
Yeah, they hadn't played live in 2 or 3 years. They recorded together in the studio. I mean, look, the White Album came out in the fall of 68. It was on top of the charts while they were doing this, right? So, but they did a lot of tracking and looping, and sometimes they would take stuff at their own homes and bring it in to Abbey Road or whatever. So the idea was like, we haven't played live. They did a TV special, Neil, when they did Hey Jude live, with a bunch of kids all around them. I don't know if it was on ITV or what, but then they, and then at the end, the kids kind of jumped on top of the risers or were sitting right next to him. And I don't think George liked that at all. But I think overall, the band's like, hey, playing live is something we used to like. So instead of doing all this tracking and dubbing, why don't we write all new songs, we'll play them live, and we'll record that, and that'll be the album. And we'll do it in front of people, because that's what we used to do. We used to be a live band, right? And so, great concept, except they're like, we're going to do this in 2.5 weeks, which is complete. It's insane to think about. When you two take 6 years to make a record, and we're like, yeah, we'll go in January 2nd. We'll have it done by, January 20th, and we'll play it live. Crazy.
So if you want to start from the beginning, that when they first get in there, you can tell this is a very, very bad idea. They're not, like, nobody seemed comfortable in Twickenham. It was this giant space. Why did you think you could write and record new songs in basically not even 2 weeks? I mean, you had 2 weeks, but they weren't working the weekends. It was just it just wasn't flowing. What I thought was really interesting is they got in there, and immediately they kind of just squished themselves against the back wall. They were all really tight together. George is sitting on the riser. Paul and John are sitting in chairs right there. They're all they're back together again in this giant spot. They had just the rando people like George's friends, the Harry Christian. What is this all about? Come on, this is just not going to work. It's just not going to flow the way that you think. Even if you had the songs, okay, we got the songs and we got 2 weeks to polish them and get them on this thing, maybe. But to write them, you could tell right off the bat they were like, "This is a bad idea. This is not going to work."
It's funny though, because one of my takeaways from this was it's such a shame that the original premise didn't turn out, and I was like, you watching it, because it looks like when you're watching it that they don't know what they're supposed to be doing. But I watched the first 2 hours, of it again this morning, and I forgot that the first 10 or 15 minutes of it takes you through their career and then clearly sets out exactly why this is happening. And like you said, Mac, it's on the back of the Hey Jude and performance and that going well, and like being in a crowd. Then it clearly says that they go into that studio with the view that they're going to rehearse 14 new songs. 14 as well. Why does that have to be 14?
Crazy.
Like, do 10. Maybe it's because all the songs are 3 minutes long. I don't know.
Yeah.
But we're gonna do 14 songs. They're then gonna record that, have a live show, and then they're gonna record that live show, and then that live show is the album, and then they also get a television program out of it, and they also get a documentary. In terms of, without sounding like a terrible middle manager corporate thing, but in terms of blue sky thinking and out of the box and all of that stuff, it's a great idea, and it's a real aspirational idea. And my takeaway was, it's such a shame that they didn't achieve that. Don't get me wrong, you still get them on top of the roof, and you get those iconic scenes, but an iconic scene is quite different to actually writing and rehearsing 14 songs, playing them live, that being your album, getting a television program and the documentary out of it. And I was quite confused during it why they couldn't pin down exactly what they were doing, because obviously one person knew what the idea, what it was, and I wondered if it was Michael Lindsay Hogg, because he's the director, isn't he?
Right.
So he's the whole point. It's really funny, really looking at everyone's motivations in that documentary. So the Beatles themselves, the four of them, have all got seemingly quite different motivations of each other. But all Michael Lindsay Hogg's going on is he just wants a story all the time. He's not really bothered what happens with the album, whether it's any good or not. He's just thinking the film, how do I make this as a story? Where's the narrative arc and things like that? And it is just like really interesting. Just like there's 9 hours of it, isn't there? But within that 9 hours, there's a million things happening at once, and that's why I thought it was just so engaging.
Well, the one thing for me was that you had to have the subtitles on, because there was a lot of stuff where it was like, first of all, I don't know who's speaking right now, and so it gave you a cue as to who was talking, especially off not off mic but off camera. And then I would have liked to have seen a little more about Michael's deal, especially when he starts to figure out that this is not going to happen. The thing that you've committed to isn't going south on me quick. Now what do I do? I'm going to have to punt. I'm going to have to go back to the powers that be and say, sorry, this whole giant thing that you've planned, not going to work out.
Yeah, I give a lot of credit to Peter Jackson and his team for shaping this, because they had, 150 hours?
Yeah.
It's crazy. You had to watch all that multiple times. You're probably tagging, this is good here. But it would take forever to do that. And when you can see them speaking, that's in the film. But if they don't have film of them actually saying those parts, well, he uses shots from around that way, so it looks like this is how the conversation would have gone. This is who's sitting in the room at that time during that conversation, to make it very watchable and have this incredible narrative. But there are a lot of hangers on. There's a lot of entourage around them at all times, not to mention my favorite member of the entourage, Yoko, sitting on John's lap or under the piano when he's playing it or wherever. It's like, we'll get into that later, because I asked all of us to have our top 10 moments from the show, which is tough, I know, and 5 takeaways from the show. And yeah, she's going to make both my lists. But okay, so before we get into the movie, now that we've set the tone, we know why they were doing this, I want to hear a little more experience from you growing up in Liverpool, where the Beatles are gods and everybody allegedly loves them. It's part of your community, I guess. But obviously not everyone's going to be like, that's my favorite band, or it's like, stop pushing that on me. So I'd like to hear a little bit more of your experience, not only as someone from England, but someone from their town.
Yeah, so just to put a time frame on it as well, I was born in 1978, so that's 8 years after they split up. So that's sort of that's where I'm coming in. And yes, it's an absolute fact that Liverpool as a city is very, very proud of the Beatles. So vast majority, even if you don't like the Beatles, the vast majority of people from Liverpool are proud that the Beatles come from Liverpool.
As they should be, yeah.
Yeah, and I also think the fact that there's a bias towards the Beatles in Liverpool is quite normal as well. I'm sure you get this in the States, but certainly with Britain, with it being so small, it's like, people from Manchester, a lot of their favourite bands will be Oasis, Stone Roses, The Smiths.
Makes
Wales
sense.
is obviously a country, not a city. But I went to university in Wales, and a lot of my friends were from Wales.
Mm-hmm.
And to a man and a woman, all of their favourite bands were, and I don't know if any of these are particularly known outside of the UK, but Manic Street Preachers, Stereophonics, and there was another band at the time in the late 90s called Catatonia, right? Like all of them, like these bands were their favourite bands. So I think it's quite normal that people from a particular city or a particular country will lean towards people from the same city as them.
Absolutely.
The Beatles is slightly different though, because they're so big, because they're so influential, because they're so ubiquitous and everywhere. Then you naturally will have, or some people will naturally have, a slight resistance to being told that these are the best band in the world repeatedly, and especially if you're young and you're a teenager, you're not interested in what your dad or what your uncles or what the old men in the pub think.
Right.
You know what I mean? It's like they're exactly who I don't agree with, and I don't want to agree with them. So therefore, in quite a juvenile way as a teenager, you're almost going to go out of your way, some people, to not like the Beatles. But it was everywhere. So in Liverpool, there's a Beatles museum.
Right.
Okay. There's a bus tour that you can go on called the Magical Mystery Tour, and I literally see it going around all the time. And it's an open top bus, so you'll have seen this type of thing back in London. These open top buses that do tours of particular things. Now Liverpool's not massive; it's got a population of 500,000 people, so you can get round the main. So you can go to Penny Lane, you can go to Strawberry Fields, you can go to the Cavern Club, you can go to where John Lennon lived and where Ringo Starr lived and where Paul McCartney lived. You can do that in like a couple of hours. So it's a big part of Liverpool's tourism, the Beatles.
I have no doubt.
And also, I've actually been, I don't know if there's ever been at any point anywhere an actual yellow submarine than the one that was in Liverpool in 1984. So without going into the politics of it or whatever, but Liverpool as a city back then, particularly like 70s, 80s, very deprived city, poverty's through the roof and what have you. So in the early 80s, the government gave us what exactly we needed. Rather than infrastructure and jobs and things like that, they just built a massive thing called the Garden Festival. And what they did is they put Japanese gardens and Chinese gardens, and they put a few rides in it and things like this. And it was supposed to regenerate the area. That was a kid. It was quite good because it was something to go to, but obviously it was a piece of shit as well. Right? But and one thing I always remember is they actually built a yellow submarine. So back in 1984, they were doing this with the Beatles as well. They built a massive yellow submarine that when you went in as a kid, there was like poles to slide down and there was things to up and down on and stuff like that. So as a child in Liverpool, you can't get away with it. And I remember in school as well, I remember having English lessons. Mr. Quayle giving us an English lesson on She's Leaving Home from the Sgt. Pepper album.
Really?
Yeah, because I always remember actually really liking that English lesson because with She's Leaving Home, it's really good. It's the whole narrative is that it's all from the viewpoint of the parents, and they think that the daughters neglected them, but what they actually show by what they say is actually how they've neglected her. and it's like you can see what they can't see. It's a really, really like clever lyric. And I remember, doing that in English. I remember like in music, we used to sit there with little xylophones, and maybe a little bit later keyboard. We'd all have to learn how to play Penny Lane. And before this, I was talking to my wife. Wife went to a different school, and she was saying, "Oh yeah, when I was at school, we had a play. There'd always be a bit in it where we all like they just somehow just get in a Beatles song, and we'd have to sing Yesterday for no reason. It's like let's just put a Beatles song in and sing Yesterday. So it is absolutely all around us here. And my thing personally with the Beatles is I don't mind them. They've never really massively spoke to me. I haven't gone out of my way to dislike them or anything like that. I like some of the stuff. But you said something earlier, which was absolutely spot on, Mac. It's like, yeah, I like them. I think they're okay. I respect them. I appreciate them. There's a few songs I really love, like, Long and Winding Road things. There's a few things like that. But did I ever put them on? Did I ever really want to listen to them? No, not particularly. And have I had it up to here, which actually that's not very good on a podcast, have I had my fill of people telling me they're the best, old men in Liverpool telling me they're the best band in the world, and they're saying that even when they're people who are not particularly into music, and they've probably only heard 5 songs themselves.
Right.
But there's this blankets. You can't say the Beatles aren't the best band in the world. So it's a real interesting mix, but I appreciate and respect the Beatles, and they definitely done a lot of good for Liverpool as a city. I think, it brings money in and things like that. But I've never personally subscribed to the idea that they're the best band in the world. Though I do appreciate in pop culture, they are probably the most influential band in the world.
Absolutely. I don't think you can deny that. I mean, any band that came at the same time or afterwards were influenced by them. Any documentary you see on any band that started in the 60s or the 70s, it doesn't matter. Like, especially in America, it doesn't matter what the band is. Kiss or the Eagles or, anybody's like, well, I saw the Beatles on Ed Sullivan and then I said, that's what I want to do. Okay, it's like every single band, whether they're heavy metal, whether they were pop, the Carpenters, it doesn't matter, man. Any level, they're like, well, I saw the Beatles and then I realized my life was different after that. So the influence cannot be overestimated.
Well, I remember, too, when Julian Lennon put out his record in 84, 85.
A lot.
And yeah, correct. And people were like, oh, well, he sounds just like the Beatles. And like, everybody sounds just like the Beatles. Everybody wanted to be the Beatles. I mean, it doesn't help that he looks just like the old man and sounds like him. But right. To your point, yes, after Ed Sullivan, everybody wanted to be the Beatles. I mean, that was the British invasion, was they just sent people, A&R people over and said, sign everybody who looks and sounds anything like this. Go.
Yeah, Herman's Hermits could have been huge, Peter Noone, cute kid, cute English boy, nice accent. He could have been huge.
What do you think it was then? So, because obviously, as you said, there's a British invasion in the States in the 60s. And I know a number of those bands do like pretty well, but none of them like come remotely close to the Beatles. The term Beatlemania comes from the response they got in the States. What do you think it was in the States that made them distinct to these other groups that were also part of the British invasion?
Yeah. They put out better music. I mean, I think pretty much it was the Beatles, and then the Stones were kind of their own thing, even though they were technically a British invasion band. Everybody else, I think, was just seen kind of as a copy. They may have had 1 or 2 hits, like the Zombies and the Turtles and people like that. But the Beatles were the original, and they were the best at what they did, writing hit songs.
And they were nice-looking lads, too, The Stones are a little scary-looking, a couple of them, especially in the later 60s, Look, the Animals, my dad will tell you that Eric Burdon can sing circles around Mick Jagger or any of the Beatles, for that matter. And he was a pretty amazing guy. But, he's kind of short, he's kind of weird-looking, and, the other guys in the band were odd. I mean, they're photogenic, and they had this machine Brian Epstein had this marketing machine with them on every cover of every magazine, all the knickknacks and the toys and the trading cards and all that stuff. And it just blew up.
The other thing too is they were a band. I think they were the first real band that we ever had. It wasn't Buddy Holly and the Crickets. It wasn't Elvis. It was a band, and each of the four guys were, I mean, I guess you could say marketed, but they all had distinct personalities. They all they could all kind of go back and forth. Like they had a couple of clips at the beginning of early press conferences, will you get a haircut? I just had a haircut yesterday, oh, they can't, they had a back and forth. It was a package deal. It wasn't, like you were saying, the Animals. Who else was in the Animals? Oh, wait. Bum, 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 bum.
Right.
I don't know. I mean, so if it was a package deal, and yes, they could sell not only the records, but they could sell posters and newsletters and pins and T-shirts and everything else. It was a machine that got put together.
Yeah, not just Chuck Berry or Little Richard or Elvis, right? Here's a group, and they're all lovely lads. They have those nice smiles.
The thing is too, and this even went into the 80s, like when we were growing up. In the United States, things from England were just sexier. They were just, it was a different place. They had different, they had a different look. They had a different sound. It was very cool to see that in the United States. They weren't from, Cleveland or Milwaukee or something like that. It was this faraway land. Everybody dressed, very proper, very English.
Well, except for our generation, Jackson, the new wave. It was color, right? It was like Duran Duran, it's like Flock of Seagulls with this weird haircut, It's like all that stuff came from England, and it was colorful, and it was new. The sound was new. It was young. It's the second British invasion, and it really hit big in America thanks to MTV because of the image that they all had. Yes, it was on the radio, but being on MTV was huge, just like being on Ed Sullivan was huge for the Beatles and then, some of the folks that kind of came after them in the 60s.
Now, real quick,
it's really interesting.
I was going to say I've got a quick question for you, and this is a cultural thing. What is with the freaking toast? It's like they couldn't get enough of it. They had a toast guy. They're always, as soon as they get in there, where's the toast? Where's the toast? Somebody got the toast? Give me the toast. I'm like,
part of tea.
It's toast. Yeah, toast and tea. I mean, they have I know Snoop Dogg has got a guy that he pays to roll joints for him. That's his job. They had that guy Kevin to get the tea. He always had they couldn't do anything, and there was yeah, exactly. With the marmalade and the butter and everything. Oh my goodness! It's just we just don't do that here.
Yeah, we do love tea and toast, and
Clearly.
Together. I mean, I'm trying to think of a cleverer answer than that's just the way it is.
Yeah.
And the crazy part is too, with those guys, they could. I mean, at that point in time, they could have anything they want. If they wanted caviar from Russia flown in, no problem. You want, French champagne, not a. I want toast. I want toast with the marmalade and tea. That's what I want. Get it right now.
But that's because action that you just can't beat a good cup of tea, and a good cup of tea will solve all of the world's problems. That's a fact. But it's dead interesting. I don't want to go off the Beatles, but I just quickly want to touch on the thing that you said about the exotic. It's interesting that we always want musically what we haven't got. So yeah, I said earlier that people will have a bias towards something, but you asked about my dad. So my dad was never into the Beatles, which is probably why I think he was a little bit too old. He was born in 1947. So when the Beatles come out in 1962, he's already 15, 16. So he's sort of too old for it almost. And obviously they're not now, but if you do look at the Beatles in 1962, they are a bit of a girls band.
Teen band,
a little bit of a boy band type thing. And it's really interesting because the stuff he was into and the stuff that I used to listen to when I was really young was all of his old Johnny Cash records, Hank Williams records,
Gotcha.
Little Richard records. All of the music that my dad liked was American music. Now, interestingly, he's actually not too far off the same age as the Beatles, probably a little bit younger.
That's right.
Who were influenced massively by American music. And I look at now, I don't want to talk about what I do, but one band, for example, that I quite like, got a very American sound.
Yeah.
And it is quite interesting that, you're often attracted to the exotic, and what the exotic is for you two is different to what the exotic is for me in terms of, I know where Penny Lane is, I know where Strawberry Fields is. I don't really want to heard about a very normal residential street
Right.
that I know about when I'm listening to music. I want escapism, so therefore I want to hear about this hotel in California, for example.
Is that the Chateau Marmont? I think it is. And yeah, that's a great. And you can check it out. It's actually our most popular downloaded album. Number 14, number 15 is their take on the Eagles, because in 1976 they released 2 diamond-selling albums. Eagles' Greatest Hits Volume 1, which is the number 1 selling album in America ever, over Thriller, and of course Hotel California, which is the best thing they ever did. But all right, well, I don't feel like we can walk through the whole thing, guys. I mean, I feel like we would need 6 shows to do that,
Do you want to do takeaways?
Or do we want moments and then we can do takeaways?
Yeah, let's do moments and then takeaways.
All right, well, I want us to all just kind of go in a round.
I would imagine we're going to have a lot of crossover here as well. So my first highlight was the secret recording of Paul and John after George's left the band.
Mm-hmm.
I thought that was really insightful, because the rest of it you watch knowing that they know they're being watched, and that has to feed in a little bit into the way you behave. But the thing that really came across to me is they're being recorded. I can't remember where it said that the recording machine was hidden. I don't know if it was in a plant pot or it was something like that.
So like the Flowers or something, yeah.
Yeah. And the talk, and this is George has just left. And the thing that really got me was how just reasonable they were, and how, so this is this fellas in 1969, and how just reflective they were, and how calm and measured they were. So George has left the band, and then rather than going, George is a dickhead, what's he doing, and all of this, he's going, you can hear Paul McCartney going, well, I know I'm like this, and I do this, and I know that I probably haven't given the freedom, and I tell him a little bit what to do. And John's like, yeah, and I do that as well, and we're quite a powerful dynamic, and you've got to imagine what it's like for George. And I just thought that was really, really insightful. One, just to hear what they say, but then I was surprised by the whole tone of it, about just their levels of self-awareness and how they were trying to put themselves in George's shoes. I thought that whole bit was great.
I'm with you there. Yeah, absolutely. They just showed a maturity. None of them were 30 at this point, right? It's like they're 28, 29. Maybe George is 27. He was always a little younger than them, so they could always kind of boss him around. But then they have this kind of understanding of each other that I wasn't talking like that when I was 28 years old. They're mature guys, no doubt. How about you, Jack?
You want me to do? One of the things for me, and I kind of saw it at the beginning, and then I went back and rewatched it. But the one thing that I really loved, it was in the beginning. It was Mal playing the anvil. Just the look on his face that he was like, yes. I get to be part of this. Oh my God, I can't believe that just sitting there with the little hammer waiting, ding, ding, ding. That was fantastic. That was a big one for me. The other one that I really liked was when they were doing Get Back, and you could see Paul, he wouldn't let it go. He just keeps going. He keeps hammering. Boom, boom, boom. Jojo left. Jojo Jackson. Okay, Jojo Williams. And you can see John start to he's starting to drift off. And then he says, Jojo left his home in Tucson, Arizona. And he just whips right. He's like, I don't know what it was looking for, but that's it. You got it. Go. And I looked at it in hindsight, how this is going to end up. You know what's going to happen. You know but just the look on his face where he realizes that's it. That's what we were looking for. That's fantastic.
I'm with you on Mal, man. His face goes ding, ding. He was so excited to be part of the recording. Yes. That was fun. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I've got a similar Get Back. It's a slightly different bit to yours, Action, but it's the bit where you essentially see Paul McCartney, and he's just there with Ringo and George Harrison, and he's got the chords and he's working it out, and he's just playing it for about 2.5 minutes. And it's the clip that you see they've put on YouTube, because it's where you really see that someone just hammering a song, working it out. And then 90 seconds in, he's got nothing. 2.5 minutes in, he's got what will become a classic song. And so actually see that happening in real time, and someone just going with a song, going with it. And then, like you said, Action is later on. You get the bit where Lennon's involved and they're working on the lyrics. So with Get Back, obviously it's going to be a major part of it's the name of the documentary as well. But there's a couple of bits there that are really, really like quite sort of special to sort of just, if you've got any interest in any music and just sort of seeing songwriting going on, whether you like the band or not. And that's why I think this works, whether you like the band or not. It's just to get to see those like creative sparks flying around. It's just something to behold, to be honest.
Yeah, just to see them create it from nothing, and yeah, it's for something that would come to become such an icon of popular culture, and it's coming out of you, like you're creating it. Yeah, it's almost like you were there with them, even though it was 50 years later.
So I didn't put this as one of my favorite moments, but it's a key moment in the film, and it actually happens a couple of times. Somebody is away. One day I think it was George was away. One day I think Paul wasn't there yet. And they're jamming, and Yoko is screeching into the microphone. And it is the most god-awful noise I've ever heard in my life. My whole thing is she shouldn't be there. Or if she can be there, fine. She can go hang out with the Hare Krishnas, or she can sit with Linda 20 yards away. She doesn't have to sit on John's lap or under his chair or be, 3 inches away from him the whole time. And somebody's like, well, she's an artist. She has a right to be there. I'm like, oh, really? Listen to this. I've heard water buffaloes being eaten alive on the Serengeti by a pack of cheetahs that made a more appealing noise than Yoko going, and it's like, I just wonder, was she singing like an angel? And then Paul came in and said, you know what, Yoko, what we could really use here is the sound of a dying animal. Can you give us that? Can you do that for us? And then she changed what she was doing. I don't know.
Well, you're talking about when they were in Apple and she was doing that?
It was twice. Yeah, once was in Apple. I think once was back at Twickenham.
Because the thing for me with that one at Apple was that she's doing that, and yes, it's grading is an upgrade to that. But Paul is playing the drums on it, and he doesn't look like he's super annoyed. It looks like he's just like, we're just kind of fooling around, which I thought was interesting. I would have thought he would have been like, oh, she's at it again. But
right.
And the other thing I kind of like too, and this was a couple of different times where they would just go and do something else. Like, they would sit down at the drums, and Ringo wasn't like, whoa, this is, no, this is my thing that I do. But you want to play the drums? Go ahead and play the drums. He picked up the bass and started messing with it. I think John, or at one point, Paul was playing George's Telecaster, but he had it upside down. It was kind of like a real free-flowing, if you're feeling it, do it vibe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right. Well, I mean, we just took like 10 minutes to do one. So we might have to start to shorten these down. But why don't you go, Neil, and pick out another one or two, that was important to you.
Well, you don't need to worry. I've covered off a couple of mine
Okay.
in that last one. A song I really didn't know at all, which for like any Beatles enthusiast listening will just be like sound like blasphemy. But I absolutely loved, and I thought this is one of the best songs that they did in these sessions, is I've Got a Feeling. And it's the very, very first one you hear them practicing at the very start of the documentary, that along with Don't Let Me Down, I think it is. But as you know, you keep going back to these songs. And I didn't know that song at all. And I wonder if it is because I was listening to that and going, this sounds a little bit like a song like the band would do. And I love the band. So I don't know if it's maybe I like it because it's sounding a little less like the Beatles almost, or the mid-60s Beatles. But yeah, every time they were playing or working on I've Got a Feeling, that was a high point for me.
Cool, good one.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to go with another one?
It kind of in the same vein as that. It broke my heart when he's playing at one point in time. Paul's playing Another Day. Every day she gets the more. That's a solo song, so he's already working on solo stuff. So I knew, and I think there was one that John played, and I don't remember what the name of it was, but it was on his first solo record. So I'm like, they've already moved past this. They're already at the end of this. They're already working on songs that would become that. And then the other heartbreaking one for me was when George is talking about I Me Mine. He's like, well, if you want, I'm like, dude, that's a good song. Come on, baby, get in there. And fine. He's like, yeah, if you want it, cool. If you don't want to play it, whatever, I'll put it on my thing. I'm like, man, he's still the little brother. He's still the dude that's like, hey, come on, guys, I can do this too. I'm like, oh, heartbreaking that something, and he just made it up that night, and it was this fantastic song that would become a classic. But it was just like, you just want to to me, I just want to be like, don't let this go away. Please don't let this go away. I know you're going to, but don't let it happen. You can still work together.
Because, see, that was my number one on this list, guys, was that you did see stuff that would become solo material. You saw Lennon working on Road to Marrakesh. You saw Ringo coming in at the beginning of part 3 with George working on Octopus's Garden. And like you said, 3 or 4 times George came up with some, well, I just started this last night. It's For You Blue, it's something. What, you just made that up last night? And so you can see that George is starting to grow out of little brother mode, right? The White Album, which had just been released a couple months before, was where he really shone, where he finally got more than just one of his songs on the album, and he could stretch out a little bit. And now you're starting to see some of these things develop. They worked on some All Things Must Pass for a little while. We saw that. So to me, that's cool. Yes, I know they're going to break up, but it shows that they've all grown up. We've been in each other's pockets since we were teenagers. Now we seem older. We're still not 30, but we're grown men with our own identities. We don't need the Beatles anymore. And in a way, you got 4 great new groups. All Things Must Pass was a triple album because he had all this backup that he couldn't get on Beatles records all that time, And I love All Things Must Pass. I love George Harrison. So, yeah, I mean, that was my number one moment, was to see all those little parts where, these didn't make it on Beatles records, but we know these songs, they made it out there,
Another one for me real quick was you were talking about the scene where Ringo's playing what would become Octopus's Garden, and they go to George, and he's got that look. It's another one. He whips his head around. He knows that's something. He knows that's not just a throwaway thing. He's got something there. And he goes and he's like, well, you could change the chord, do it like this. Wow, that's really cool. He understands that is something workable, not just, playing garbage.
That's a real highlight as well, I thought, because it's one of the few points in which you see a different dynamic. So a lot of the dynamic is Paul McCartney in particular suggesting to other people what to do,
right.
And obviously there's the John Lennon bit. So to see that bit where it's just, I don't mean the lesser 2 members, but the others, the non...
The less represented members, right? Yeah.
When they're having their own little interaction, and George has got that sort of role of authority when it comes to Ringo, and he's helping him out. But that's really good, the way you see that dynamic. And I thought that bit was really it was a really pleasant watch, and just quite heartwarming, that bit where George is helping him out with Octopus's Garden.
I agree.
Well, and I know because I was watching with my wife, and she was like, "Well, I don't get why wasn't he credited then? I mean, he's helping him write the song." And I said, I think it was one of those deals where he kind of pointed him in the right direction. It was Ringo's song. He didn't want to step on it. Well, you better put my name on that too. It's just like, no, here you go, buddy. I'm pushing you in the right direction, like you said, like kind of like now he gets to become like the big brother and say, here's how you can kind of flesh this out. Yeah, that was I love that scene. Now, well, I mean, if we're talking about it, we'll get to this. Has to be on everybody's top 10. The arrival of Mr. Billy Preston when he comes in, because I like to use the word stone cold. He was ice cold, sub-zero walking into there, just like, what's up, fellas? How you doing? You want me to sit down and play? Oh, and that changed the entire dynamic after he came in and started working with them.
Yeah, I've got exactly the same. I've got written down here, Billy Preston, shining light. This is what I've written, because he literally just lights the whole thing up. You can see just adding one other ingredient to the mix just freshens everything up. All of a sudden, they're all get into the groove of it and everything. And literally every scene he's in, he's playing, they look happy.
And the other thing too is I think there was one scene where there was a little bit of back and forth, but for the most part, they just let him do it. Like you can see him he's watching, and he puts it in there. And the same thing with Ringo too. I know Ringo gets maligned a lot, but they don't really give him a whole lot of direction at that point in time. Like there were a couple of points, but usually he listens, and then he just fills right in exactly what's needed.
It's just on, yeah. No, it's ironic you called him a shining light, because just a few years later, he would play on Shine a Light on the Rolling Stones' Exile on Main Street, which is our show coming out this week, the 50th anniversary of Exile, So that's fun. No,
that was an excellent segue. That's brilliant, man.
Thank you. Yeah, that's what I do.
You could tell you've done 50 odd episodes.
You tell I have not a lot else to do during the day. No.
Hi, I'm Amanda Lehman, and you're listening to Ugly American Werewolf in London Rock Podcast.
No, but back to Ringo, honestly, guys, for a fun part. In part 3, at one point, Ringo's sitting on the floor. Paul's talking about what they're going to do next, and Ringo looks up and goes, "I've just farted. I thought you'd like to know." I'm like, that's so funny, man. It's American juvenile, yes, but it's also, he's being very polite about it. Like, you may not want to walk over this way, gents. I've just let one go. Just, FYI. I'm like, well, that's a funny moment if ever there was one, right? All right, so you can point out a more mature one, I guess.
I've got one that's not just one particular moment, but there's a section of it. There's a bit where they're just enjoying playing a load of the covers that they used to play in the Hamburg days. And I think it lasts for maybe like 10 minutes or so in the actual program itself. And this is part highlight and part takeaway from me. But what it really does was it really illustrated how, even though they're not a live band anymore, how just all of those hours and hours and hours that they played, starting back in Hamburg where they played like 8 hours a night, which just sounds mad, how they've got this encyclopedic knowledge of songs that at the flick of a switch, they could also start playing again, like, because he played them so many times, like back in the day, and you really got that sense of, I think, me personally, I often think of the Beatles less as a band of great musicians, but a band of perfectly acceptable musicians who write great songs. And I think when you see them do all of those covers from the Hamburg days, not that they're particularly difficult songs to do, but you just see the absolute professionalism and tightness and unit as an actual group, as like a little band of brothers almost. And I thought the playing of those songs, and there's loads and loads of times, when they're writing songs in this, or they refer, a lot of their musical references, especially John Lennon, he'll refer back to, well, do you remember in Hamburg when we did this? And it's strange because Hamburg seems like an age away.
Right.
But realistically, it's only like 9 years. This was earlier. I mean, like now that takes us back to about 2013, 14, which isn't that long ago.
Right.
But it's really interesting how that experience that they had in Hamburg makes them the band that they are, and also how important they see it and they rely on it and they constantly reference it. So I thought the whole sections when they were doing those covers was just really, really, it was great to see, and it was interesting as well.
With you there. Chuck Berry, Hank Williams, all sorts of stuff, Go ahead, Jackson.
Well, I was going to say that one of the big things for me was, you were talking about them playing together, and they referenced this a couple of times, was the absence of Brian Epstein. And Paul saying they need Daddy around to, kind of corral everybody. I think that was a much bigger loss than maybe they had thought about before, because he really kept them on point. And I think Paul had to take that on at that point in time. And you could really see how, especially when George walked out, and then they had that next day where they were sitting around like, what are we doing? And his whole thing is, come on. We got to move forward. We can't let this day go to waste. We can't let these things, it slip away from us. I think that may have contributed a lot to his kind of demeanor at that point in time, where he had to really drive the ship now, or it was going to go off the rails. One thing that I wrote down too is I would have loved to have seen this same exact thing for an earlier record, like maybe even Hard Day's Night or something, because at this point in time, Lennon and McCartney, everything is still Lennon and McCartney, but they're really not writing songs together. They're definitely helping each other out. But I really wanted to, that would have been great to just see them, just the two of them. No one's married yet. Nobody has anything else. They're just working. And so I wondered how the dynamic would have been different back then.
I thought it was interesting when, in the first part, George is talking about how Eric Clapton is the best at being able to kind of play and do lead and do these runs. He's like, yeah, I can't really do that well. Eric's really the best at it. And then once George leaves, John's pretty flippant about it. I don't know if it's the end of part 1 or the beginning of part 2, but I think it's the end of part 1. He's like, if he's not back by Tuesday, we get Eric Clapton. It's like, it's just that easy. George leaves, we just get his best pal who can outplay him anyway. And I'm like...
Now, you say that, and I picked up on that too, but they didn't do anything about that, though. They were real quick to say, we need him back in the band.
Of course, yes.
Yeah, I thought that was good because, yeah, they could have, at that point in time, they could have gotten anybody, including, perhaps, a young Mr. James Page to come in. That would have been interesting. But yeah, it wasn't even like like you said, it was a flippant comment that he made, but they never really seemed like they explored that. There was never an option. George has to be back in here. Let's go see him right now.
Yeah, but if you ask Eric Clapton, I saw him in an interview. He was like, did you ever think about being in Beatles? Did I think about it? Yeah, I did, because they had money and they had power, and that sounded pretty good.
I wonder as well with that as well how much he really meant it, and how much of it is just putting a brave face. Because it links a little bit to one of my highlights. Less a highlight, just more something I noticed and was of interest to me, and it is about John Lennon. And it's when Paul McCartney is going through Let It Be and he's playing it for the first time. If you watch John Lennon for the whole time of playing Let It Be, I mean, Let It Be, like everyone knows Let It Be. It's like, like worldwide, like classic, like a legacy song. And he's got a matter of fact attitude towards it, like, oh yeah, you've just written Let It Be. But I wouldn't even say it's matter of fact. He's almost got like a mild contempt for it.
Yes.
There's a bit where he's like taking a piss a little bit out of the lyrics.
He is.
But what's really interesting, we know now that, and you would imagine Paul McCartney never told John Lennon this at the time, but we know now that the words to Let It Be come from this dream that Paul McCartney had, where his mum spoke to him, like this like really profound moment where it's like his mum was visited from like the grave in a dream, and she's just said, oh, like, let it be, and all of this. And then he's wrote this like heartfelt lyric, and it's gonna be like this great song. And then John Lennon's just there, like, just taking a piss out of it, and just like, and I found that all the way through. And I've watched interviews since with Paul McCartney, and he talked about how John Lennon like never really gave him any credit, or was never really nice or complimentary about anything that he wrote, just because that's the way he was.
That's John.
And I think John Lennon's whole demeanor and attitude in it at different times is just really interesting. Like, sometimes he really looks like he's enjoying it. Sometimes he's just totally taking a piss, and it seems like he's trying to undermine other people. Sometimes he looks completely disinterested. But my main point is, I just think it's really interesting when you see them writing classic songs, and other members of the band are like, meh.
Right.
Yeah, another song. Yeah.
Or he's mouthing words in a funny way.
Yeah.
You need to take the piss out of Paul.
And I think that's really good, because in a way I think fans of any band, it's interesting. Like, we often all probably a little bit too serious and like, have these great reverence for these songs, but for a lot of these musicians, it was the job, and they just knock these songs out and then move on to the next one. And
right.
And they don't have the same reverence as musicians as we do as fans, and it's quite sort of good to see that side of it sometimes, and just none of this needs to be taken that seriously, really.
Yeah, we get into that in my top 5 takeaways. We'll get into that for sure.
Well, and one of the things too that I was noticing, especially when they got to Apple, was the guys in the recording studio, Glenn Johns and everybody. Okay, here we go, 1, 2, 3, boom, they go into it, and then they just wander off. Okay, I guess that wasn't a take. Well, let's keep going. I mean, are we going to do this for real? Are we going to mess around? You had that back and forth of, I've got a job to do, especially when they said, at one point in time, Johns was already committed to another project. He had to get this thing finished, and now we're playing, Chuck Berry. Okay, guys, we got to get you back on point here. Are we fooling around? Or are we doing this for real? And another point too, one of the things that I was going to point out is Glenn looked like he could have been in Oasis in 1996. I think someone ripped their look off from him.
Oh man! Well, he's from one of my favorite moments, because in part 3, it's kind of like they were thinking about doing. Okay, they're not going to go to Libya because that's nuts. They were thinking about doing Primrose Hill here in London, which is a place that I visit a couple times a week. It's about a mile from my house. I take the dog over there. There's a good butcher over there. Plus, it's got this incredible view of London you can look down on. And if they played at the top of that hill, that would have been pretty special. But then they said, okay, but we can't do that. Now Paul's like, oh, this is really falling apart. We're really not going to get a spot. And then Glenn and Michael come over to him with the suggestion of, what we could do. And you don't hear them saying it, but you can see Paul his eyes light up and point like up, like, yeah, we could go up on the roof. And then they start exploring it. And to me, that's really neat because Paul was definitely down. He wanted to do it all. He had the ambition. He sees himself as the leader at this point, which he absolutely was. And now he's like, it's not coming together the way I hoped. And he's like, oh, yeah? Good idea. Let's go check it out. And of course, the rest is history.
Yeah, there were a couple of moments where you could tell McCartney was, they would tell him something. He was like, yeah, okay, whatever. That's, maybe we could look at that. Like, that's a no-go. Like, instead of him just saying, no, that's not going to happen, it was kind of just brush it off. But yeah, you're right. And Glenn knew that they were in trouble and he had to salvage something. So yeah, when he had that idea, it was like, okay, now we're back on, push it back to do something constructive. Because yeah, we have to get this thing done.
Yeah, we got any more moments you want to make sure we talk about there, Neil?
I will package together 3 George moments, and I've packaged these all together in a way in terms of I'm thinking like Michael Lindsay Hogg now. I'm thinking of the 3 episodes as a whole, and I'm thinking of it as something worth watching and being a story and having like a narrative arc. So I think a highlight is George leaving the band. That infinitely makes everything more interesting. So if you're telling any story that's ever been written has to have a problem in it that is overcome. So the problem in this story is George leaves the band and George isn't happy. So that was one thing. The very fact that he leaves, that's good.
Yeah.
It adds a little bit it adds interest and drama and jeopardy. The second thing, ever since we said we were going to do this, I've been dying to ask you both about this moment because I'm not too sure what I think about it. So George has left the band. Mm-hmm. The next day, they're all waiting around. They're trying to get in touch with John Lennon, and I think it's just Paul McCartney's there, and Ringo, and a few other like randoms are there. And then there's a bit where Paul McCartney's talking about it, and there's a real close up. There's a real close up that holds on his face for absolutely ages, and on his eyes in particular, and it looks like he's starting to fill up, or he looks like he's starting to get like upset. And there's a bit where he puts his hands over his face and he just stops, and the camera just holds on him. Now I don't know if he is actually starting to get emotional and actually starting to fill up, or whether it's just one of those things, where like if you put a massive close up of our eyes. Now they would just, the longer you look at it, the wetter they would look, and it's just like we have wet eyes, and I was just thinking, I don't know at all whether at that point he is getting emotional or upset, or it's just a trick of the camera because he's just holding on his eyes for ages. Did you notice that? And if you did, do you think he is getting upset or not? And if you don't know what I'm even talking about, that would suggest to me he isn't.
I know that. I wasn't sure if he was getting upset or if he's just worn down at that point. It's like maybe he's getting emotional, like, oh my God, my band's falling out. Or it's like, oh, it's just one more thing. I mean, why am I still a Beatle? I mean, I think at that point, a lot of them didn't not want to be Beatles, but they didn't just want to be Beatles. It was a tough time, Plus, they're going through these relationships. I mean, Paul had broken up with Jane Asher, and now he's with Linda. John's with Yoko. She's still married. There's the part in the picture where her divorce goes through. So they finally got that out of the way. Ringo's still with Maureen. Obviously, that doesn't last because of Ringo's behavior, So they have so much more responsibility now. And like I said, they look older to me than just 28 or 29 or whatever they were, because they did have so much responsibility and they had done so much work the previous decade as far as touring and recording and all that. So I probably didn't pick up on it the way you did now, Neil. But I don't know if it was that session or the one that came like the next day. But they were kind of sitting around in a circle. They'd gone to see George, and George is like, no, I'm not coming back. Forget it. So then they come back that next Monday or Tuesday, whatever it was. John and Yoko aren't there yet. So they're talking about, I think George has a problem with Yoko always being there. Yoko's sitting on his amp. Why is Yoko in the band photos? She's not a member of the Beatles. She didn't play the Cavern Club. Why is she here? Like, I got a woman too. She doesn't have to be 3 inches away from me. And Paul was pretty philosophical about it, and talking about how, no, they just want to be together, and who are we to say that they shouldn't be. But then they were talking about how, all right, so Michael's there. He's still trying to push Libya. And then he's like, oh, we could do it in Brighton. And Lynn goes, oh, yeah, Brighton would be great. And Paul says something like, stay out of this, Yoko. Like, he says that to her. And to me, that's a great moment because it kind of reflects everything that was going on, but already they're aware of it. Like, Yoko's already a meme in early 1969 before the problem with the Beatles, right?
Well, going back and watching that again. Yeah, I was going to say, going back and watching it again, so Ringo gets there first after the meeting, and they say something about how did it go? He's like, it went all right at the beginning, and then it kind of fell apart at the end, and they're kind of talking back and forth. And he straight up says, Yoko did all the talking for John. And I didn't pick up on that the first time. I was like, okay, yeah. That's the deal. But I think, to your point, I think he was getting emotional, and I think everything was kind of crashing down on his head at that point in time. He could feel it slipping away. George was gone. Then John's not showing up.
And sniffing a lot of heroin in those days.
Well, that doesn't help John either. Yeah, there was a clip too where he's walking out. Ringo's walking out. He's going to have lunch with. I think he's going to have lunch with George, and he asks him all, any of those pep pills? Any pep pills hanging around? I'll take a couple of those. But real quick, switching gears here, another big one for me that I kind of picked up on the first time that I watched it again was that sit down that they had. What was his name? Dick James, the publisher.
Mm-hmm.
And he's going through that, and they're like, okay. Publishing rights, as far as like the music and how it works out. And I'm just sitting there thinking, Paul McCartney, you're a billionaire because of this. Because of what they're talking about right now. And he's like, do people really buy that music? Who's going to buy that? Like a piano person? And I'm like,
buy it yourself, Paul. Buy it.
Yeah,
man.
This conversation you're having right now is going to make you a lot of money down the road.
And then he goes and gives the same advice to Michael Jackson, doesn't he? Who then buys all of the rights to the Beatles songs.
Yep.
Well, that was a sore subject later. Yes. Yes.
It's actually in one of those conversations as well. He shows a real foresight, Paul McCartney, because he actually says people will look back on this in 40 years and say the Beatles split up just because Yoko sat on an amp.
Right.
And that's exactly what everyone does think. That is pretty much what everyone thinks. And by the way, my last one on meet George Harrison and the actual story of it. It's really, there's a cool little bit. It's really subtle, when they're on the top of the Abbey Road studios, and he pulls the lead out of the amp because the police are there and they've got to turn it off.
Mm-hmm.
It's really interesting that the person who puts the lead back in so they can carry on is George Harrison.
It's George, that's right.
You get this really cool. Like if you were writing a story, it's like the character in it who doesn't want to do anything or go anywhere, is quite resistant and leaves the Beatles at one point. He's the one that when someone else tries to pull a plug on it, he goes nah, and actually plugs it back in and carries on the music. So if you were writing that, you couldn't write that better. And the fact that it goes that way is great.
Yeah, no, George definitely had a problem with authority. That's what the tax man is all about. He assaulted, allegedly, a nightclub bouncer in France. That's why they couldn't go to France, because George was going to get rung up in France. And number two for me was George and Paul arguing, especially the part where George is like, what makes you think I'm not going to play it right? If you don't want me to play it all, I won't play it all. Just tell me what you would like me to do, what will please you, and I'll do that. And then Paul gets all defensive, and I'm like, this is a big moment, and it's something I'd seen and heard before, but then to see the whole context of what was going on when that happened. I've been seeing that since I was a kid, and see this moment that I'm sorry that I know, you don't annoy me anymore. Like, anymore he doesn't annoy you? So he used to annoy you, right? And still, and he's pushing against that authority because Paul's the older guy, telling him since he was 13, play it this way. John and I wrote this, you do this. He's like, no, Paul, I'll play it, just give me some space, will you? I mean, that's kind of part of this whole, and it wraps into all his leaving and everything else.
And that was the weird part too for me, is that when he leaves the band, it doesn't really seem like there's that hard stop moment. Like he's just kind of like, I guess I'll just leave the band, and because they were really starting to groove there. And like, what do you mean you're going to leave the band? What are you talking about? See you around the clubs. And he just walks out. And I always thought it was like this big screaming, screw you, no, screw you. You can't tell me. But it was really just almost really subtle. And he just gotten to the end of his rope. And I think it was part of the fact that at that point in time, McCartney and Lennon are standing and they're really grooving back and forth. And I think he just he just kind of got to that point where he's just like, well, I'm just always going to be the background guy. And they're never going to take me seriously. I'm never going to be at the same level that they are.
Yeah.
Never. So you know what?
Even though John's coming in with nothing, and I write I Am Mine one night, and I rate, For You Blue the next night, And
Correct.
It's like, I'm doing some good stuff here. And then they come to my house, they want to talk to me, and instead of the guy, John Lennon, who I looked up to and recruited me into the Beatles in 57 or 58, he's got Yoko here talking for him. It's like, why are you talking to me? Why isn't my friend and mentor doing the talking about our relationship? Why are you even here? That's just what I pulled out of it. That just could be my thinking. But I love my life and my woman, but she doesn't need to sit on my lap while I'm working.
Not at work. That was it. That was the thing that I knew that she was there. I just didn't realize how present. I mean, like she was literally just touching him the entire. Okay, get away from me.
Have your own identity, right?
Correct.
Come on.
Correct.
Well, I had a couple of other things, but honestly, I think, it's kind of about songs, and one of them is just about Henry Cooper, just because my dad got to see Muhammad Ali, still Cassius Clay at the time, fight Henry Cooper at Wembley the summer of 1963. So when they're trying out the two of us, and then at one point he's going, Henry Cooper, and they flash pictures of Henry and Muhammad up there. I'm like, yeah, because Muhammad Ali is from Louisville, and my dad knew his managers. And before he came over to bike around Europe, he said, yeah, come meet with me. I'll be at the Savoy. I'll get you a couple tickets. And he got my dad like 6th row seats. Like he sat in front of Frank Sinatra or something crazy like that.
So when I was looking at those pictures, when they were talking about that, did they actually fight, or was he in a car accident? Because he looked like he had been beaten to a pulp, and Ali was just kind of standing there like, hey, how you doing?
All right, well, they actually fought twice. I think the first fight was a little closer. I think the second fight was just like a payday for Henry, and Muhammad knew he was going to win. I think, Neil, maybe you can educate us on that.
No, I don't really follow boxing, unfortunately. I'm a lover, not a fighter, you know that.
That's for sure.
And that's why we love you.
Well, so let's get, because gosh, we've already done this a little bit longer. Let's get to our 5 takeaways, man. Obviously, this was epic. And like you said, it gave us a new appreciation of this band that we've been appreciative of, but kind of lukewarm on. And after seeing this, I kind of have an interest in maybe going back and listening to some of their stuff and maybe getting to know stuff that I've overlooked or maybe only listened to a couple times. So why don't we start with you, 5 to the top. Jackson, we'll let you start this time.
Okay, so 5 to the top. I mean, number 5 has to be that, to me, the takeaway. George still felt like he was a little brother. Paul was definitely the ringleader at the time. They were still, even though this was the end of their time together, they were still at the top of their game, still professionals, could just jump right back in there. They could start first thing in the morning and just start to sing. There wasn't like I got to warm up. I mean, they were on it the first thing. Billy Preston was the 5th Beatle. He was not just a musician. I think that he helped them get this whole thing over the finish line. And the other thing that I really took away was that they just didn't seem the same without the hand of Brian Epstein on them.
Going to be a lot of overlap between you and me, Jackson. So why don't we give Neil a shot here for his 5 to 1?
Yeah, and some of mine I've already mentioned. As I said, there's a little bit of crossover between highlights and takeaways, but and mine are both about the Get Back documentary itself and the Beatles. So I've mixed the two things together. So the first takeaway is that Peter Jackson's done a great job on this, and the whole thing just oozes quality. And I saw a little bit of criticism about the fact that it was 9 hours long. I couldn't agree with that more. I found the whole experience of watching it really calming and soothing in some way. I don't know if it's the Twickenham studios and like those lights they had behind, but I just found the whole program, whatever you want to call it, documentary, really immersive. And like just the quality of like the actual film as well, like the first scene where you see it's just the man brushing the floor and everything. It just looks like it could just be from like a proper Hollywood film. Just the actual quality of it's great. So that was my first one. Oh, number 5. Yeah. Number 4 would be what I said earlier on. Was it was a real shame that they didn't actually achieve the premise that they set out to record this album in 14 days. Write it, rehearse it, and then record it in front of a live audience. My third thing was, again, I mentioned it earlier, seeing the Beatles as a real unit, as a true band, especially on those Hamburg covers, and actually seeing how just naturally they just could play together. It's exactly what you just said, really, but like they just come in, they switch on, they can do it. There's no warming up. They're just oozing talent. Plus, they're like the consummate professionals, even though they can't make a decision. So there's that as well. The other thing was the opening sequence before you actually see them. That's a bit more documentary. That just tells us what happens from when they like the
57 to 68, basically.
Yeah, that I think was just shows how in such a short amount of time what the Beatles did and how they grew and how much they changed. And that is where I get my real respect from the Beatles, is like that just level of growth and development and just how much they packed in what really was like a 7-year career when it comes to albums.
Right.
I mean, we do podcasts talking about bands that have been on for decades. We've probably, let's be honest, haven't done as much different stuff in 2, 3 or 4 decades as the Beatles did in 7 years. And then my last takeaway from it is Paul McCartney. I know this is only a snapshot of one time in their career and doesn't give us the whole picture of their whole career, but I wasn't aware of just what a driving force he was in that band. And I actually thought throughout it he's actually being really reasonable and trying to give other people their space to do things, but just how unbelievably creatively prolific he is. And also, one thing that really came home with McCartney is I love his voice, and I love the tone of his voice, not his speaking voice, his singing voice. And people often have that discussion: are you a Paul or are you a John? Watching that has definitely put me in the Paul McCartney camp. And I have never, ever, ever owned a Beatles album or anything, right? I never had any interest in it. Yesterday, when I was in the record shop, I ended up actually buying a Depeche Mode album, I'll be honest with you. But I did have in my hand for a while the Abbey Road album, and I was going to buy it. And but I'm going to buy it next time, but I've never even contemplated it before. So it has actually sort of really ignited my interest in the Beatles, and especially that latter part of the Beatles from, say, 66 onwards. And I think in the next few weeks, I'm going to buy my first ever Beatles album.
Good for you, man. That's awesome. Yeah, that's cool, And I'm like you. I never had Abbey Road until I moved 40 meters from Abbey Road, and it was its 50th anniversary. I'm like, all right, well, yeah, I guess maybe now I should go ahead and pick one up. But no, you're right about Paul McCartney. Actually, Paul still has a house just north of the Lord's Cricket Ground, which is maybe a 10-minute walk from Abbey Road Studios. He bought it in 1965 for 40,000 pounds. I think it's close to $40 million now, maybe. I did take a stroll by there. I walked the dog by there, tried to make sure he did not pee on his door. Maybe his neighbors, but I'm like, no, that's Paul's. Don't do that, dog. Anyway, all right. So number 5 for me, I just want to do a rundown on all the guys. For 5, Ringo is still underrated. Yes, he was apathetic and kind of tired in this, but he was always spot on. The rhythm was always top notch on every take. Paul was in charge. John was a better guitar player than I ever gave him credit for. As a guitar player and playing lead, he was really good, and I didn't realize that. George was over it at this point. He's like, I don't really need to do this anymore. And Yoko still sucks. I always thought Yoko got a bad by the press. They weren't really fair to her, but she still sucks. Number 4 was they're great musicians who would jam and figure things out together. And a lot of these are similar years. But we saw everybody behind the drums at some point. We saw everybody on the piano at some point. They would pass around the guitar. If Paul was on piano, sometimes someone would play bass. They would all play that pedal steel slide a little bit. And it was just cool to see them do jams of stuff, and maybe none of it made to record, but still, this is how the organic stuff happens. You just get together and jam, and that's the way it comes together. So that was 4 for me. 3 was kind of similar to yours. I never realized losing Brian Epstein was such a dramatic thing for them. And you could tell there's no adult around. And they started to manage themselves. And we saw that they were maybe taking meetings with Alan Klein to see if he was going to do it, which in the 69, the Stones would have maybe recommended him. By 72 or 73, they probably wouldn't have. But the thing is, yeah, maybe they can manage their business affairs, but they can't tell each other, you need to be here at 9. You need to be ready to work no later than 10. You need to leave the wife at home or in the control room. There's no dad to tell them, you can't do this. It's time to work. So it really changed them. Number 2 for me was Billy Preston saved the day. Okay, they were struggling a little bit. Billy comes in, and now John's engaged, and now Paul doesn't have to play the piano on every other song, and George is psyched, and he really saved the day. And I'm glad that he never played in Twickenham, because it was obvious that Twickenham was just not the place. And they needed a different place. And when they got to Apple on Savile Row, it changed. And it just coincided with the fact that Billy was there. And then number 1 for me was, yeah, they were breaking up. They had other things going on, but these guys had fun together in the studio. Even though they weren't best mates maybe anymore, they had grown apart. They're laughing, they're singing. When they were doing a silly version of the two of us, John and Paul, singing silly, or maybe singing between their teeth without losing a lip. My daughter's cracking up at that. Like, this is great. These are the guys I love. Or they're reading the tabloids and they're singing the tabloid song or something like that. So they had a sense of humor, but they also were self-deprecating. They could take the piss out of themselves just as well as they could, anybody else. So that just, to me, just shows it's too bad what happened. But it's natural because we're all married. We all know how hard it is to be married. And now you got to be married to 3 other guys who are all of a sudden incredibly rich and wealthy. Not to mention they're also married to women. It's like, it's hard to manage all that. And the fact that, and of course, bands didn't stay together. If you were together more than 18 months, like, wow, you're a really successful band in like 63, 64. Nobody stayed together 2 or 3 years. So the fact that they were together more than 10 years, if you take them back to the Quarrymen, certainly even when they got Ringo, that's a decade. Nobody thought that would happen. And maybe it went on longer than maybe it should have for a lot of different reasons. But the fact of the matter is they were mates. They were friends. They've been through a lot of stuff, just the 4 of them. And they still had a good sense of humor, still had a lot of fun together. Whereas the Eagles fucking hate each other, okay? They go on stage for 2 hours, they walk off separate buses, separate planes, and we don't even want Don Felder here. He doesn't even get to come into the band anymore. But those guys were friends.
Yeah. And you talk about, like, the 3 other guys who nobody else on the face of the earth could, to know what you went through. I think that was definitely the bond that kept them together. They were still, when they got back in there, they were still the guys who were playing at the Cavern Club and, just enjoyed being around each other when the music was the main focus. I mean, other things were starting to pull them away, but when they could concentrate on that, you could still, they were still having fun and they still enjoyed each other's company.
And I think it's good that even though that the band ends on poor terms and they split up and everything, is that, and it's from interviews I've seen since and everything, is like, before John Lennon dies, Paul McCartney and John Lennon have made the peace and are actually visit each other and are still friends. And he just talked about the old days. George and Paul and Ringo, they all stayed friends. So that relationship. This documentary catches it at that time where maybe it's just starting to get a little bit shaky. But it's good to know that beyond this, it gets worse again. But then ultimately they all come back together and they still end up friends, which is heartening.
Yeah, and the nice part, too, is they never put out a record without the 4 of them. It wasn't, somebody left and then the rest of the Beatles put out a record, or they didn't, there was never a failed reunion tour or anything like that. It kind of it ended and then that was it. And I did see a clip of a deal with John and Yoko walking, I guess, through Central Park or something, and it kind of hammered home his position. Like, these guys were, oh, hey, look, they were playing basketball or something, and he walks by this chain link fence. Hey, I know you, man. Hey, what's going on, man? Hey, when are the Beatles getting back together? and the look on his face is like, I that's not me anymore. Like, I don't do that. I'm trying to move, but they would never let him. Right. I don't think ever really get past that. Not at that point in time. Not in the mid to late 70s, whenever this took place. So I think that for John, that really kind of weighed on him a lot. Trying to make his own way in the world. So
overall, I mean, sounds like we all really enjoyed it, and it sparked our greater appreciation of this band. That, again, it's not like we dislike the Beatles, but it's kind of like, hey, yes, I like the Beatles in that I like water, but I'd rather have a Guinness than water. I think if it does that, especially for people our age, now we're closer to 50 than you are, Neil, but I looked at the thing, it's like the majority of people who watched this documentary were 55 or older, which is kind of old, even though we're not that far away. You've got further to go. But Jackson and I have always skewed older on our musical tastes, and for this to give a new appreciation for the band that really started it all, it obviously wouldn't just be for us. Hopefully it's for a lot of other people out there as well.
Yeah, and I think the one thing that it really did for me is it really hammered home, and I kind of always knew this in the back of my mind, but it wasn't just Lennon McCartney. Like, yes, they did the bulk of the heavy lifting as far as the songwriting, but the other two guys really served an important piece of the puzzle that they couldn't have just brought somebody else in. Mm-hmm. There's a great line from Linda where she just kind of offhand, like when Ringo shows up that day that after George leaves, she just says, "Oh, everybody's more relaxed when Ringo is here," or something about that. Like, I'm always relaxed. Like, that was his deal. Like, he just cooled everybody out. He served a very important role. They all did. It was a band. It wasn't just the two guys or one guy or anything like that.
Yeah, parting thoughts, Neil, or final thoughts?
I think my final thoughts are even though I approach this with a respect for the Beatles and I don't know what the one word is for not minding the Beatles, whatever the one word is, that sums that up. The one thing that was apparent to me as I was watching it and was afterwards is, like, I can't think of any other band that I'm not a super fan of that I would give up 9 hours of my time and stick with film footage like this. And I think that is testament to the Beatles and to seeing their creative process and them as individuals and their personalities, and also the way in which this whole thing was put together. So I'm not a big Beatles fan, but I tell you what, I don't think I'd watch 9 hours of many other bands. So, right. And I think that's down to that unique, special nature of the Beatles, whether you're a big fan or not.
Well, maybe we can all get together and do all the Iron Maiden, like the early years, part 1 and part 2, and do all those things together. That we could do pretty easily, right? Well, why don't you tell all our fans out there where they can find you? I know you've got a new Facebook page that looks really good. How can they find DefLepPod?
So I'm on Twitter as @DefLepPod. I'm on Facebook as DefLepPod Neil. You're right, I've got a Facebook page which is just DefLepPod, and I've also tried again to get into Instagram, even though I don't really know what I'm doing, and I'm on that as DefLepPod Neil as well. But to be honest, the easiest way and the way that I understand the most is Twitter. So Twitter's the best @DefLepPod.
And well, what about? Can you give us any previews on episode 20 or 21 stuff coming up?
Yeah, so episode 20 is coming out within the next week or so. That's on a song called Now, which is from Def Leppard's X album, which is routinely regarded as their worst album. So I'm not expecting many downloads for that one, but it is what it is. It's all part of going through the catalogue. So yeah, that's the next episode up. So I'll try my best to make it interesting, even for the people who hate the song.
Excellent. Well, hey, look, we can't thank you enough. We appreciate you being on, and you are welcome anytime, my friend.
Oh, thanks. I really appreciate you inviting me on again. And I was touched and had a little tear in my eye when I was listening to your last episode, and you were doing your review of the year. You were far, far too kind. And as I said to you, I really enjoyed being on your podcast as well. So yeah, I'll come on anytime. Fantastic.
Appreciate it. Thank you, Neil.
Now that was a fun episode to do. Not only to be able to hang out with Jackson and Neil and have a great conversation, and we always do whenever we get together, but it was great to be able to review such an amazing piece of film, right? This documentary, nearly 9 hours long, on a band that we weren't even that enamored with, and somehow we couldn't stop watching. And there's so many amazing parts to it, kind of showcasing all the inner workings of the biggest band that ever was and really ever will be. Think about all that was going on there. They've been without their manager now for more than a year. They've got all the money they need, but they still need to continue to work and move forward artistically and financially. You got George Harrison starting to write great songs, even though he was always kind of pushed to the back all those years. You got John dealing with problems with the media, problems in his personal life, drug problems. You got Paul trying to put a family together and lead the Beatles without any kind of management or leader present. Very interesting times. An amazing film. Peter Jackson and his crew did great work. Just a lot of fun to be with my friends, Jackson and Neil, talking about that. And we hope you enjoyed it. Hope you enjoy the show. If you haven't seen it on Disney Plus, I highly, highly, highly encourage it. As always, we want you to tell us, did we get something right? Did we get something wrong? Did we miss the point entirely? There's some big Beatles fans out there. Tell us what we're missing out on. You can tweet us and DM us at ugly_werewolf or at actionjack72. And make sure you check out Neil. DefLepPod is a great podcast. Episode 20 has already come out as we're releasing this, and you can check him out on Twitter at DefLepPod. And make sure you subscribe and download wherever you get your podcasts, be it Spotify, Amazon, Apple. We love good pods. Great place to reach out and find new fans and other great podcasts. And you can check out every past episode at www.uglyamericανwerewolf.libsyn.com. Next week, we're very excited. We have a special guest on, singer, songwriter, guitar player, Amanda Lehman, who you may have heard us talk about before, as she has played with Steve Hackett in his band. And when we did review of Steve's show at the London Palladium last fall, she was part of the opening 5 or 6 songs, the solo part of Steve's show. And she's got a new album out, Innocence and Illusion, which made my top records of 2021. She was kind enough to join me and Jackson for a talk about what it's like to tour and play with Steve, and we walked through the entire new album. Please come check that out. That'll be out on Thursday, January 27th, 2022. Until then, rock and roll fans all over the world, be cool and stay safe.